Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our VLGA Connect special episode this afternoon, a discussion about the chairing of effective virtual council meetings. Lovely to see so many of you joining us this afternoon. I'll introduce our panel members in just a moment. My name is Chris Eddy, and it's been my privilege to be hosting a series of interviews for the VLGA Connect series these past few weeks. This is our first live panel with an audience experience, so please bear with us. We're looking to have a bit of fun with the concept. So now to our topic for today. Thanks to an amendment to the Local Government Act, which was passed by the State Parliament last week, councils in Victoria are about to have the option of running virtual council meetings from Friday, in fact, the 1st of May. We've all been part of a huge increase in video conferencing in recent weeks due to COVID-19, and in some respects we've come to be quite experienced with the technology. However, the role of the mayor or the chair in a virtual environment brings some additional pressure and challenges. You might have heard Zoom fatigue as the new buzzword in the last few weeks, and that's a real issue for chairs, particularly in running effective and efficient meetings. So today we'd like to talk about these challenges and how we can make the task a bit easier and perhaps less stressful. So let me introduce our panel. Firstly, Ruth McGowan OAM is an author, facilitator, former mayor and councillor, and is going to share with us some insights into how mayors and councillors can prepare and contribute to a smooth meeting experience. Ruth, please say hello to the audience.
Hello, everyone. I'm hoping you can.
We can hear you. I think your internet is a bit spotty, but we'll bear with you, Ruth, and I'll come back to you in a second. Thank you for that. Councillor Stuart James is with us. Stuart is the Mayor of the City of Monash and works in the network security field as well. He's done some analysis of the different various technology platforms that are available, and we'll share some insights of those, particularly from a mayoral perspective. Stuart, hello and welcome.
G'day, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. All your technology is working terrific. Kathryn Arndt, the CEO of the Victorian Local Governance Association, the VLGA, is with us to provide a VLGA perspective on how the sector can be supported during this transition, including the preparation of guidance materials for councils. Kathryn, hello. I hope you're there somewhere.
I am. Hi, Chris, and welcome, everyone.
Terrific. And finally, Stephen Cooper of Civic Mind, a governance specialist, who'll keep us in check with regard to what the legislation actually allows for and requires, as well as what councils need to be doing in terms of their governance processes to cater for virtual meetings. So thank you. And Stephen, hello.
Hello, Chris. No pressure.
No pressure indeed. I'll introduce Deborah, who's not going to show herself, but Deborah is there on behalf of the VLGA, monitoring the chat window, capturing your questions, and she'll be my conduit to know who has an issue they'd like to raise. I'll come to Stuart, who's the Mayor of the City of Monash. Stuart, you've been running some virtual meetings in an internal sense for quite some time. How prepared do you feel you are for virtual formal council meetings?
I don't think anyone can be prepared, Chris, and I think that even after we have today's session, there's going to be so many questions, and adapting to how, particularly how other councillors react. I think there's a lot of faith in our fellow councillors to do the right thing, but as the Mayor, I suppose that's half the challenge is keeping people in line, keeping them in order, and making sure that they're not going outside the boundaries. It's a bit easier to control that, obviously, in the chamber, but how to do that over technology is, I suppose, what we're going to tackle today.
Indeed, and I know you've done some analysis of some of the platforms, which is one of the things that's challenging some people. So we might come back to that in a moment to see what sort of observations you have. I'm going to bring Kathryn in briefly. Kathryn, the work of the VLGA in this space, I know you've been monitoring very closely this transition to virtual meetings from an advocacy sense, but also having some input into the guidance that's being prepared.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, the VLGA has actually been working with Local Government Victoria and other stakeholders to develop the draft guidelines, or the guidelines that will actually support the sector in conducting formal virtual council meetings. I believe that the Minister will actually be launching officially those finalised guidelines this afternoon. So that's something that we're all looking forward to receiving, so that we can actually have some clarity about the guidelines that will support the legislative amendment. But I can say, Chris, that the guidelines are very high level. The last time I looked at them, there were about 3 or 4 high-level protocols that were included, and I'll just, if you like, would you like me to touch on those now?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, sure. So they included things like the principal one was that all virtual, ordinary and special meetings of council must be publicly streamed live. That the ordinary business of the council must continue, and that there must be representation at council meetings by members of the public. So very high level principles, and the reason for that is that each council will already have in place local laws and governance procedures that support the business of council, and the CEO and the governance teams will need to look at those local laws and governance rules to ensure that they support the council in hosting virtual council meetings. So from a councillor's perspective, it will be really important, I think, to talk to your governance team and CEO about how the local laws and governance rules of your respective councils will support virtual council meetings.
Okay, thanks for that as an introductory comment, Kathryn. I want to bring in Stephen now, the last member of the panel. So Kathryn's touched on the governance side of things. I guess the first thing we should establish, Stephen, is what does the legislation actually require of councils from the 1st of May?
Okay, Chris, thank you. My summary, and I should say at the outset, Chris, is a non-lawyer summary, and there are some terrific local government lawyers who will no doubt be called on when things get really tricky. But this new Part 12 is reasonably simple. It basically says that attendance at a meeting will include electronic means of attendance in terms of the councillors. It says that meetings being open to the public includes meetings being streamed. It says that there's no requirement to stream a meeting when the meeting's closed under Section 66 around confidentiality. And then it avoids all doubt and says basically that a council or a committee is not required to allow the public to attend a meeting, which presumably says a meeting can be entirely virtual. But it also would leave open the possibility of a part physical attendance, part virtual meeting.
So if I can just lob a question into you straight off, Stephen, councils can still have a meeting under the existing physical conditions, I'm assuming, as long as they can meet the requirements of physical distancing, correct?
That would seem to be the case, Chris. There's nothing there that overrides or writes down the current requirement for a physical meeting. So this is an expansive piece of legislation which adds to the means by which a council might comply.
We might move into some questions because we are starting to get some questions from the audience. And the first one is from Bernadine Voss, the Mayor of Port Phillip. Now, Bernadine, I'm not sure if you'd like to ask your question yourself. I'll take you off mute.
Hello, Chris. Thanks very much. I guess we've been having discussions about this issue going on. Our first council meeting is next Wednesday. And one of the councillors is insisting on turning up to the chambers. And while that's possible, I just wanted to know if the VLGA has any advice around that. I understand from the Premier, it's, you know, if you can stay home, you must stay home. Just wondering how we balance this requirement where we can all meet virtually, but some people really want to still turn up to the chambers.
So you can leave home for work purposes, of course. So I imagine a councillor might argue that they're leaving for a work purpose, but I don't know whether Kathryn or Stephen might like to start with tackling that very interesting question.
I'm happy to go, Chris. I think there's nothing in the legislation that would prevent a councillor from meeting at the council chamber, but I'd go back to the point that you raised, that clearly the intent is, so far as is possible, to avoid public gatherings, and if someone is able to meet away from the chamber, then they ought. Similarly, in terms of the gallery, there's no requirement that the public be required to attend a meeting. So there is no requirement that the council open the meeting up to the public, but the Act is silent on the councillor in that situation, which would indicate that maybe they should be there. They should be able to.
And I guess I'd wonder the value for that councillor of being the only person sitting in the chamber, and what's the difference to sitting at home participating via whatever the technology platform is. Kathryn?
Yes, look, I think in my conversations with the Minister, and it lends itself to Bernadine's comment, you know, clearly the Minister is encouraging, in the interests of maintaining social distancing and reducing the need for public coming together, that councillors would not meet in the chamber, and hence the provision now for them to meet virtually. We should say that this provision exists for 6 months only at the present time. You know, yes, perhaps if a councillor would like to go in to the council chamber and dial into the virtual meeting that way, they could be accommodated, but I would think the council would go back to, again, its local laws and governance procedures as how they would manage a situation where a council by majority have deemed to take a certain action. And I guess if the majority of the council would like to proceed with hosting that virtually, and for some reason a councillor doesn't have the technological equipment or understanding to do that from their home, I guess arrangements could be made for them to come into, you know, the workspace of the council. I'm not sure if that's helpful, Bernadine, but the intent of this legislative provision was to enable councils to make a decision as a whole about whether they'd like to meet virtually or not.
Yes, and some of the comments coming in through the chat around this, Councillor Maynard from Wyndham points out that under rules you can't meet in groups, so the physical distancing requirements obviously still need to be met. This is harking back to holding meetings under usual circumstances. And Councillor Grisbeck from Geelong asks if there's a possibility of a hybrid, some at home and some in the chamber. I think we've possibly answered that by dealing with that particular question there. So I'm going to move on to, I'm going to try once more with Ruth, and I think we might have tried turning Ruth's video off so that perhaps we've got audio. So Ruth, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Fabulous. Let's try for the third time to get some comments from you. We're very keen to hear about your guidelines and how you've gone about putting them together.
Yeah, well, my guidelines have been based on what I've been hearing from mayors and councillors around some of the problems going virtually. And what I'm learning too is that probably 80% of running a virtual meeting goes into the preparation and testing and preparing to get the procedures right. So, and then 20%'s on the night or the day. So get everything right and test.
A few people already asking how they can get a hold of your guidelines, Ruth. So I might just at this point out that we will send out a copy to all those who've registered for today's session. But I noticed that you've been fairly active on LinkedIn, for example, so people could reach out to you via that platform.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Yep.
So one of the things that we did talk about touching on, Ruth, was the various components of the technology. And I want to come to Stuart in a moment about the different platforms, but there are a lot of tools available within the technology that could be a help or a hindrance, a distraction or smooth the effective running of a meeting. What's your advice to people on where they start with those options that are in front of them?
I would talk to their CEOs and their council officers, obviously, to see which ones meet the good governance requirements. But the tools are really important as engaging community members as well. So perhaps practice with some of your community engagement virtual meetings by using some of those tools. Some of them are for collaboration. Some of them are for engaging. You know, you've got virtual whiteboards. You have to work
Ruth.
extra hard to keep people engaged, and tools can help.
Thank you, Ruth. So, Stuart, if I can come to you now on the technology. I was having a chat with someone earlier today who's on a number of audit committees, has had 4 meetings in the last week, and every one of them has used a different technology platform. That's starting to create some challenges for people just as they get used to one. I know you've looked at the various ones that are in use and have some insights for us.
Yes, just before I go there, if I can just talk back to the live streaming, the question before. My understanding of the Local Government Act is that you can close meetings to members of the public if you live stream. That was where that was, rather than the virtual meetings. So I think that's what that reference was. In terms of the different platforms, there's quite a few out there. Skype and GoToMeeting are probably the legacy platforms, if you like, that aren't used too much anymore, but are certainly still around. I won't go into those because I don't think anyone will actually use those. The three which probably most people have experienced over the last couple of weeks are Cisco, Microsoft Teams, and obviously the one we're using at the moment is Zoom. Cisco WebEx, or Cisco itself, has been around for around about 20 years. They, or a bit longer than that now, about 40 years. They started off with network security and did a lot of the switching and data center stuff in the background. So they're well known for their security. Microsoft Teams is a relatively new platform on the market. Only about 2 or 3 years ago, I think Microsoft have released that, but that's very quickly coming up to be probably the lead in the sector. And Zoom, obviously, which we're using at the moment, which was sort of just a startup business 4 or 5 years ago, and is prominently almost the leader in the field, I suppose, at the moment. Obviously, with everyone meeting remotely over the last couple of months, there's been, as you'd imagine, a lot of hackers and people trying to break into these different platforms to try and get in the back door, and Zoom certainly experienced a lot of issues in that respect. There was a bug at one stage that allowed people on the other end to hack into people's webcams and microphones and activate them remotely when they weren't using their computer. There's been meetings, or data for meetings has been routed via Chinese servers. There's been no encryption from the end to end. So from computer to computer, there's no encrypted sessions in there. There's been some data mining of LinkedIn profiles that have happened through Zoom. And of course, everyone would have heard about the Zoom bombings, where people have been jumping into Zoom meetings and posting up child pornography and the like. Most of those things have been fixed. There was a new platform released 2 or 3 days ago, Zoom version 5, which says it's fixed most of those issues. I suppose we'll find out over the next week or so whether that's actually the case. But I suppose the key with Zoom, as it is with any of these platforms, if you're worried about your security, the best thing you can do is not download the actual app, but to run the meeting in your browser, because the security features are through the app itself, not through the platform in the browser. In terms of different things that are available to them, Microsoft Teams obviously only has 4 people on the screen. That's it's going to be 9 in about 2 weeks' time. I'm told it's coming out into pilot. And also guests being able to raise their hands is something that Microsoft Teams is also bringing out in the next couple of weeks as well. So that will bring it up to speed with the other platforms. The big advantage for Zoom above the other platforms is it gives the presenter an ability to mute participants. So for example, now, Chris, you could mute me and I wouldn't be able to unmute myself and start talking again. So it gives you complete control over the meeting. Microsoft Teams and WebEx don't have that functionality. So the presenter mutes you, you can just unmute yourself. And particularly for a mayor running a meeting, that can be problematic. So that would perhaps be the obvious that Zoom is the way to go. Just need to be mindful of those aspects. And I suppose in terms of a public live stream, it's not a major issue if someone, for example, jumps into a meeting unopposed because it's an open meeting. But I'd question whether there's some security concerns there, particularly when it comes to closing the meeting into confidential business aspects. But obviously the governments and IT teams, local councils will do their due diligence on that end.
Stuart, as a network security professional yourself, are you concerned about Zoom? Because I know some councils have actually said they won't use it, and certainly government departments are saying they won't use it. Well, we're using it here today simply because it's the most simple and functional tool available to us.
Yeah, look, I mean, I do have my concerns, and I've raised that in a couple of other council-related activities that we're involved with Zoom. I suppose being in the network security field, my PCs are pretty secure, so I'm probably in a better position than most. But I think those will be dealt with in due course. I don't think it's a long-term issue. The capabilities of Zoom are far better than the other platforms at this stage. So yes and no. At the end of the day, if someone invites you to a meeting, you're not going to reject it most of the time. So you just have to put up with it, I suppose. Okay, thanks for that, Stuart. Interesting. We might go to a question from the audience now. Lauren Reeder is with us. I'm not sure, Lauren, I've just taken you off mute.
if you're able, well, I'm trying to, it doesn't seem to be doing it, you might have to do it yourself. If you would like to ask your question about petitions.
Oh, thank you, Chris. I had a few questions, so I'm glad you clarified. Yeah, my question was in relation to petitions. So our local law provides for the tabling of valid petitions. So let's assume the petition is considered valid under the local law, but a councillor can table a valid petition at an ordinary council meeting. And we're developing an approach to that for the virtual environment. And I suppose not tabling it in person because we're not all sitting in the same room. I was seeking some clarity on whether an appropriate approach is that the councillor does what they need to do, which is under our local law, sign it and consider it valid and somehow provide it to the CEO and or the governance team, that would be me, prior to the meeting, and then it's sort of verbally confirmed on the live stream.
Great question, Lauren. Steve, would you like to tackle that one?
I agree with the approach that you're taking. And to take a step back, I think it's really important that as a first step, and Kathryn touched on this before, there is a walk through the local law to identify what clauses of the local law are actually contrary to these amendments to the Act if a council is going down the virtual meetings path. But then this and a range of other provisions will need to be read in the way that you've done it, as how would it work in a virtual meeting? And clearly someone can't physically present a petition, but you need to meet that intent. And that might also happen in terms of voting or taking divisions, things like that as well. And I think what's the most important is to meet the intent in terms of access and transparency.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for the question, Lauren. Great to see you. Doug from Cardinia has made an interesting point that we might want to get into. Kathryn mentioned the council needing to resolve to meet online, which I hadn't been aware of before now. Interesting question. Is it necessary for the council to meet in person to do that, as that would seem to defeat the intent?
I think that it's the CEO's role to call the meetings, and the CEO would tend to informally speak with the councillors, and I would proceed on that basis.
Okay, a procedural one that's come from Councillor Bill Bennett of Whitehorse about the procedure for virtual voting. Is it a show of hands? So this is going to come down to your local law, your meeting procedure, and we should talk a bit about that, I think, Steve, first. So what are you advising councils to do with regard to their existing meeting procedures now that the virtual option is live?
Chrissy, if we're talking about voting and show of hands as an example, I think that's one where looking at what's practical. And now we're waiting on the minister's guidelines. So let's presume, for example, that the guidelines require councillors to be visible. In that case, if councillors can see each other on a screen and it's okay for the mayor to see that someone's put their hand up, then a show of hands would work. There might be a circumstance under a division, for example, though, where for clarity, a mayor might require councillors to indicate whether they're voting for or against, provide that extra level of certainty. I think, again, as long as the minimum standard is met, that people know how councillors have voted where required, that's the important thing.
Can I just clarify on council needing to resolve to meet online? Because that's certainly not my understanding of the changes to the Act. The changes to the Act are that if a councillor attends via an online forum, they're deemed to be present at that meeting. So I don't think there's any requirement there for council to meet or resolve to meet online. In fact, I don't argue the opposite. I don't think council should resolve to meet online or not to meet online. I think that if, for example, if we're meeting in person and a council says, I want to meet at home, we don't have the legal ability to say, no, you can't do that. That is provided for under that Act change.
Yeah.
Perhaps touch on that a little bit.
I think that's probably right. Steve, you'd support that view?
I agree with Stuart, yes.
So the issue of procedure for virtual voting, I'm sorry, Kathryn, did you want to add something to that?
Yes, look, I just wanted to pick up Steve's comment and some of the questions that are coming through on the chat function there, which are excellent questions. I think in the absence of seeing the finalised guidelines, we need to be a little careful of preempting some of the answers to those questions. What we will do, the VLGA will do, of course, we're taking a note of all these questions, and once the final guidelines are released, will be able to provide some clarity on some of those questions. But I think the most important thing is to go back to your local laws, particularly in regard to how you might vote and how that would need to be demonstrated in a virtual meeting sense.
Yeah.
I think, Chris,
So,
sorry, Chris,
yeah,
this comes down to which technology we're using as well. So
yeah.
Zoom can have up to 49 people on the screen, and WebEx can do 25. Microsoft Teams at the moment is 4, but it's, as I said, it's coming in there in 9. If you're on a Zoom meeting now and you're looking at me on a big screen and there's a couple of people at the top, just up to the right of the City of Monash logo, there's a button there which will allow you to see every single person in one view that's on this chat at the moment, so you can see everyone. So that ability is there to see everyone at one stage on most platforms except Teams, which is, as I said, coming in a couple of weeks.
I think it depends on what platform you're using. For example, I'm on my iPad right now and I don't have all the options that Zoom offers, and WebEx offers different options if you're on your iPad. So it depends on what platform you're on, what options you have available to you on each of the two tools.
That raises an interesting point about councils needing to, I would have thought, ensure that every councillor has a level playing field in terms of the devices and the technology platforms that are available to them. Does anyone care to comment on that?
Yeah, look, I'd agree with you, Chris. I think that especially for the mayor, I mean, if you're going to run a virtual council meeting and you can't see everyone on the screen, then that's going to be a bit of a nightmare for you to try and run a meeting, especially if you can't see people. I noticed someone in the chat brought up their points of order. If someone's muted, that's a very good point, and that's where I suppose what Ruth was intimating and having your practice sessions and what I said earlier with having buy-in from your councillors is, if you're going to have a point of order with everyone muted, it needs to be something like, that's my way of signifying a point of order, but you've got to establish those ground rules before you go into the meeting. Otherwise,
yeah.
it pass.
A really good point that's been noted is that the Act talks about holding the meeting via or participation electronically, which could mean being on the phone rather than through an audio-visual channel. Steve Cooper, is that the way you understand it? Would being on the phone constitute the same as being there via, say, a Zoom or Microsoft Teams?
Chris, I'd have to go back to Kathryn's comments before. It would if you only read the Act, but we don't know what the guidelines are going to say on that point. And the Minister may well make a specification.
Okay, so we are waiting to see what those guidelines say. Another excellent question that's come through from Councillor Jonathan Marsden at Hobson's Bay. Jonathan, are you with us, and would you like to ask your question about that issue we've just been discussing?
Yeah, so given that the Act allows, or the amendment to the Act allows audio-visual or visual, or audio, sorry, so you've got two choices. If we as a council insisted that everyone be visible to each other, what grounds do we have to enforce that? Would we have to pass our own local law if a councillor decided that on the strength of the Act they could simply dial in?
I don't think you can change a local law, Jonathan, to be contrary to state law. So you certainly can't by the Act at the moment. It'll depend what the guidelines are that come out later this afternoon, as Kathryn said. But I certainly don't think councils can be overriding what state law is, and that's, I suppose, where we were talking before about if everyone's meeting in person and one councillor says, "No, I want to meet from home," I think legally you're obligated to make that happen.
And now I think Ruth's participation is largely going to be via the chat window now due to the technology, and she's made the suggestion that councillors should practice their meetings with rehearsals before going live to help iron out the difficulties and address some of those problems, which is being supported by some of the others in the meeting, and that just seems to make good sense. Steve, while I've got you as the last commenter there, just back on the local laws, I've seen in other states where they've had perhaps more time to prepare for virtual meetings, they've actually gone through an amendment of their local laws to allow for the options of virtual meetings, and it appears that they intend that those local laws are going to remain in place from now on, envisaging perhaps future requirements for virtual meetings. What do you think about that approach?
Chris, I think that remembering that this amendment is a new Part 12 to the Act, which will be excised basically on the 2nd of November. If there was to be a more permanent arrangement, I mean, I don't know, but you'd sort of predict that it would be more integrated with the rest of the meeting procedures of the Act rather than its own section. I'd be reluctant. Remembering too that councils are going to need to review their current local law as part of the governance rules. So that's a process to be done. But there's not going to be many meetings between sort of July, August when that would happen and the election period anyway. I kind of think it might be an exercise that doesn't yield a lot of fruit.
Thanks, Steve. Now, I know Kendria Pope is with us. Kendria, could I invite you to join us if you're comfortable? Because your question about public participation in issues like dealing with public questions, I think, is a really good one. Would you like to bring that into the conversation?
Yeah, so I just posted on the chat, just really interested in hearing about how different councils are thinking about facilitating public participation in their council meetings. You could obviously go a very conservative way by taking those questions through normal digital means such as email, or you could go the other end of the spectrum and really open up the meetings in a contained way or a much more open way to questions and answers throughout the course of a meeting. Now, that pattern and variability is already apparent in different local governments' approaches to public participation, but I'm just really interested, and particularly because whilst the issues and the challenges around connection can be largely managed through the provision of equipment and the management of councillors' connections, through the provision of a SIM card, for instance, but it's much more difficult when you've got people at home with the variability in their home connections, and that can make that participation really, really challenging. I'm just really interested if there were further capturing of the different approaches that are being considered, because it is a real opportunity.
I can't recall which councils, but I have noticed that some councils have already been using the technology to provide for remote participation by gallery members, perhaps in planning, consideration of planning matters. It might have been that I read. I think some of our audience are offering up some suggestions how they're dealing with that. So I would invite anyone in the audience who has some experience with that to please come on and tell us. So Christine, I think you've got something to contribute. Is Christine with us?
Yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Hello.
Mine's Alexander Shire. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. We have yet to have an online meeting, of course, but the plan is we've already put in our council column in the local paper, encouraging people to send in their questions via email or a phone or write to us, and they will be read out at the meeting with no more than 3 minutes per question. And then we've also, I think our governance department are working on either letting people come in remotely on Zoom, or they're going to provide ability to come into the council chamber one at a time, or socially distanced, and ask their question via a machine in the council chamber. I'm hoping none of my councillors are going to show up in the chamber, but I know at least one likes to if he can. So we might shoo him off to the council lunch and keep him away.
Great contribution. Thank you, Christine. I don't know whether Steve or Stuart might have a comment on that, because it occurs to me that councils have different approaches to public question time, and in many they're enshrined in their local law meeting procedure, aren't they? So there's a few things I think to consider about that.
Yeah, well, certainly in Monash, we made changes to our local law. It started this term, actually, it was due. And we had a provision in our local law that anyone or any member of the public that wanted to ask a question had to be present at the council meeting, either them or their representative. Once all this COVID stuff blew up, I took the step of saying, well, I'll be their representative and I'll read their question out in the public chamber and read out the answer there, so at least it's publicly answered. I think, and I know that there's some people that would suggest that we should use all the different technologies available to us, such as the polls in Zoom and the chat features, and allow the members of the public to jump into the stream. I tend to be wary of that. I think that there's a real possibility that it'll just take the meeting in a different direction, and it'll be very hard for the mayor to control that sort of stuff. I think it's a lot easier for us to conduct a meeting and do the meeting exactly as we would in a chamber, but obviously do it in front of a computer instead. And I would very much, well, my personal opinion is that I don't think that we should have people talking and interacting online and using all those technology features, because I think it takes away from the core business of government, which is to speak on and debate motions. And I think we can get too tied up in all the little bells and whistles on the side.
If I might just, I guess, follow up from Stuart, absolutely. I think Steve had a conversation with the company secretary from Yarra Valley Water last week with you. Yarra Valley Water have been conducting virtual council meetings now, I think, for a month or so. And one of the comments that Lisa made was that, in fact, the chat function, and you're experiencing it all now firsthand, can be almost like some people sitting around you on a table having a private conversation. So whilst there are these very interesting and sophisticated tools available, Stuart's exactly right. It is around conducting the ordinary business of council as you would in a chamber, except you're in front of a computer. And of course, there's some opportunities and some considerations that come with that. And I think once we see the guidelines this afternoon, that will certainly give your governance team some more information to be able to support you in running those meetings. And even just being part of this today, I think, is a good experience for us all to think about what some of those might be. Yeah, so I think Stuart really hit the nail on the head with that.
Thanks, Kathryn. I'd like to invite Kylie Grisbeck into the conversation if you're with us, Kylie, mainly because you're my local ward councillor, and I'd like to say hi and you have a question.
Hi, thanks, Chris. I just wanted to ask Kathryn, in her meetings with the Minister, if this is something that he would be looking at going forward after the COVID-19 is finished, because I think from a parental experience, or even someone that's not able to physically get into the chamber, this is something that we've been looking at for a long time. And is there an opportunity that he would be thinking about this going forward?
Thank you, Kylie, for that question. My understanding from conversations with the Minister and Local Government Victoria is that because this legislative amendment was part of an omnibus bill that I think addressed 14 different portfolios, it did have that 6-month timeline on it, as you've pointed out. What would, if, for example, as you are all aware and we're all waiting with bated breath, the Minister will make a decision in coming days about whether or not the elections in October will continue or will be deferred. If the Minister makes a decision to defer those elections, it will require a bill to be tabled in Parliament and a legislative amendment to be made. So my understanding is that certainly the provision to be able to conduct virtual meetings in very special circumstances, such as a bushfire, a crisis, or a global health pandemic, may well be something that the state's considering to be an ongoing provision. And perhaps the opportunity will be when we have some clarity around what's happening with the elections, because you could tie that up with that bill that would then have to go to the Parliament. But I guess, unfortunately, that's all of the information that I have at this stage. But I think the provision would be really more around in the event of special circumstances, as opposed to an option that could be used anytime. But let's wait and see where we go, I guess, after we know about October.
Thanks, Kathryn, and thanks, Kylie, for the question. Lovely to see you on our chat today. There are some good comments coming in the chat window, particularly around that issue of public participation in meetings that we'll look at sort of pulling together, I think, in our wrap up. I'd like to see if Andrew Dowling is with us, because Andrew has a question that relates to the guidelines and Section 223 processes, and of course everyone's in the middle of budget process at the moment. So Andrew's asking if the guidelines are going to address Section 223 submissions. They're not a nice to have, but an obligation under the Act. And particularly important, as I just said, with budgets coming up, what sort of weight would the guidelines have? Kathryn, do you think that's something that's under consideration at the moment as well?
I think I would have to defer to Steve on that particular question. I can't recall it coming up in our conversation, Steve.
No, I don't either, Kathryn. And the topic will affect every council. It would be good to have a uniform approach across the sector to that, and I couldn't give you one today.
Okay. Next, I'd like to call on Tony DeFazio, who I haven't seen for quite some time, but is well known to many around the sector. Tony, welcome to our discussion. You were making some comments there about these processes, so I'll invite you to ask your question.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, my question was in regard to Section 223 of the Local Government Act, in regard to our draft budgets and the fact that the community have a right to make a submission. And until community engagement policies been adopted by councils, 223 continues to be implemented. And my thinking is that in regard to that, if we do get submissions where people have indicated that they wish to be heard, then we must allow them to be heard. And my thought would be that through Zoom, we would be inviting them to into the council meeting to present their case. I mean, that's one way. And the other way is if they're happy to, they could submit their submission and allow us in the meeting to read their submission on their behalf.
So on that, I see Blaga from Nillumbik is making some comments about the process that Nillumbik has put in place. Blaga, are you prepared to tell us a bit about your approach?
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. Just in regards to this, we had a conversation a little while ago, preempting that we'd probably be in lockdown and having to do some sort of virtual meetings. The council is very strong on continuing the community involvement in decision making, and we wanted to ensure that we had every opportunity to do so. So our IT team and governance team worked really hard to set up the Zoom platform. We've done a numerous testing to ensure we've met the security measures as much as possible. We've worked with the governance team to set up some privacy and some messaging in regards to when we send out the link to the people who have requested to speak to their submission. So the two options they have is to either contact council and request to speak on the Zoom platform, or they can prepare their 3-minute submission and we'll have the CEO read it on their behalf.
I'm interested in Steve's opinion on this, because Section 223 of the Act specifies that a person that wishes to be heard has a right to appear in person. And I'd suggest that the legal definition of in person is not across Zoom. The omnibus bill that was passed last week, I think it was last week, everything moves so quickly at the moment, was with reference to a councillor being present at a meeting. I'm not sure how that would affect the public, and certainly my understanding is that if someone wanted to be heard in person, we'd still have to invite them in to be heard at council. Now, whether that needs to be in a chamber or whether it be just in a function room with 5 people sitting in corners of the room, my reading of the Act is that would still have to occur. But I'd be interested to hear what Steve's thoughts are on that.
They just might be appearing in person before no one, Stephen.
Well, they might be, Chris, because I think you can still come back to the point the council's not required to allow the public to attend a meeting. And I guess my uncertainty was around what if someone, as Stuart said, wanted to appear in person but were constrained by the technology. And that's the bit I just don't know what the implications would be if they felt that they'd been denied the right to make a submission, which is probably, you know, the risk that you take. That said, the approach that Blaga and Tony have pointed out is, sounds quite reasonable, but for the point where someone might argue that they've been denied that opportunity.
Now, here's an issue that I thought might come up, and I'm going to invite Kim McElhiney from Wyndham if you're happy to ask your question about conflict of interest. Kim, are you with us?
Yep. No, when you've got conflicts of interest, my concern is and supposing everybody is on the screen and you have to leave because you have a conflict of interest, it is extremely important that the mayor coordinates and brings you back into the meeting. I know that sounds, but it's happened to me. So, and I would only like to see this just in a pandemic situation. I would definitely not like to see this as a permanent arrangement. How do we deal with conflicts of interest? Sorry, confidential meeting procedures as well. They could be recording there's a whole lot of things that need to be looked at. I prefer to have the person in. The best way to do it is have the person in the room, particularly when you're making huge decisions and really confidential ones. I think it leaves an opportunity for leaking as well.
So to address the first part, Steve, I imagine again it's going to come back to an agreed set of protocols and procedures.
I think the important one for me, Chris, is, and they're both really good examples, Kim, thank you, is that they have to have the absolute best quality assurance in the process that's adopted. In neither case can you rely on a staff member to hit the right button at the right time. There needs to be some independent means of ensuring that with a conflict, the councillor has been excluded from the meeting, whether it's via a waiting room or some other. And as you've suggested, Kim, that they're invited back to the meeting and it doesn't proceed until they're back. That requires a number of people to check. Likewise, it is potentially catastrophic if confidential information is accidentally leaked. So
yeah,
you can't be streaming that because someone forgot to hit a button.
Can I just ask, the other thing is, because there's a whole, look, if this is going to go on for 6 months, perhaps, I think if we're going to have protocols, I really think every councillor there should be a set agreement and like we have a code of conduct, is that every councillor signs those protocols for meeting procedures if we're going to have virtual meeting procedures. I'm not sure what other, I just thought on it then. I thought to myself, there has to be an agreed around the table of protocols that everyone will follow, and there are serious consequences if you breach any one of those protocols, particularly the confidential stuff.
Care to comment, Steve?
Chris, I agree absolutely about the protocols, and the formality needs to be up to each council concerned, but certainly an agreed position amongst the councillors as to how the individual aspects of the meeting are going to be dealt with, like the ones that Stuart raised before about dealing with points of order, voting, all of those things. It's important. Remembering issues around confidentiality and conflict of interest, though, still go back to the existing code of conduct. So, for example, it's feasible, no one here would do it, that a councillor leaving a public meeting, a meeting that's open to the public for a conflict of interest could go to another room in the house and view the document. You can't, view the meeting. You can't do anything to stop that, but it would still be a breach of the code of conduct.
Yes, and Councillor Marsden makes a similar point that if you've dialed in on the phone and you leave your phone and go to another room, how would anyone know whether you're present or not? So there are some finer points there that obviously will need to be worked out through practice. It also occurred to me through that discussion, Steve, in a physical environment, there's usually someone in the council chamber that's supporting the running of the meeting. And so, if a councillor has to leave the room due to a conflict, someone's designated to come and fetch that councillor back. So I imagine it's about clear roles and responsibilities in the virtual environment of the people involved as well, isn't it?
Exactly, Chris, as if it were a physical meeting. And another one that was touched on earlier, and again, a protocol, there's times where the meeting pauses so that the mayor or chair can seek advice from the CEO or a governance team member. So that would have to occur in the same way that it normally does, and they would need to be afforded some privacy. So working through those protocols is really important, and having someone responsible at each stage.
Look, I think, Steve, you're right. One of the principles did refer back to the fact that the existing code of conduct still applies, of course, all of the local laws and other governance procedures. And I think the expectation of, and rightly so, and as our community would as well, would expect that the elected representative, the councillors, whether they're meeting virtually or they're meeting in a chamber, are actually adhering to those required rules and good governance procedures. The VLGA certainly spoke with IBAC and also the inspectorate when we were considering the guidelines, and I understand that they had input as well with local government Victoria in finalising them. So I think we would hope that that the councillors are well aware of those responsibilities regardless of how they meet.
Thanks, Kathryn. Look, we've just about exhausted our time. We have allowed a bit of extra time if the questions keep coming. And there's one topic we haven't really touched on that we sort of promoted as being one of the key things for this discussion, and that is the issue of Zoom fatigue, for want of a better word. And I'm wondering whether, you know, someone like Stuart perhaps, or any other mayors that are with us that have had some experience in conducting virtual meetings, albeit not formal council meetings, how do you manage the fatigue issue and keeping everyone focused and being able to run an efficient meeting while people are obviously distracted by their surroundings?
Well, if I can be completely honest, you can't. But to be honest, you can't do that in the chamber either. We have, and I better be careful what I say here, but we have councillors that zone out of council meetings and sort of disappear for long periods of time. So I don't think that's going to be any different in the online world. For me, I've also always made sure I've got a big jug of water next to me. I've also got a little couple of snacks, where they be fruit bars or nuts, peanuts, or just something to keep me moving and doing things around, because I think that's half, you know, you're up and down in a chamber. When you're behind a computer, you're in a stationary environment. So make sure you've got things around you. And all means, if you get to a boring topic and you're not the mayor, walk off and grab a cup of coffee and come back, just so that you're moving and you're keeping yourself active.
I think regular breaks is something that Ruth would certainly recommend. Ruth, I'll have one last go to see whether your internet might have stabilised, to see if you'd like to add any sort of final comments on that.
Yes, Chris, it stopped raining here, so that's great. One of the things I would, thinking about where we're going, this is an opportunity as well for councillors to think about how they can use this technology to continue to do their community engagement, not just now, but beyond. So there is lots of opportunities to practice running Zoom meetings with, whether it's your progress associations, your business groups or whatever, and get used to using this technology, because really meeting around a chamber table is, you know, 19th century ways how councils used to work back in the 1800s. So it's time to come into the digital world and engage your communities digitally now and in the future as well.
Ruth, you were also making the point in the chat room, I noticed, about these protocols being good to have in case of future crisis or disasters such as bushfires, which is a good point. It's not that long since many of our councils were dealing with just that.
Yeah, so often physically constituents can't get in through the roads, or floods or disasters, and we know with climate change we're going to have a lot more of that. So everything that's been put in place now is not just going to go out the window come November. It's going to be useful for the future as well. So I think there's some great opportunities here to go digital with meetings and with engagement technology. Terrific.
Thank you, Ruth. And we will get some definitive advice, I think, around the Section 223 and its consistency with Section 394 issue, because that appears to be something that people would like to be a bit clearer on. I think we'll wrap it up. It's been a terrific conversation. I would like to thank everyone for being a part of it. Internet notwithstanding, Ruth, thank you for your contributions and all the very best. Your guidelines can go out to people who've registered, but people could reach out to you directly via LinkedIn, etc.
Yep, sure. Thanks, Chris.
And how's the book going? You're in a second printing, I think. Is that
first one's sold out. So if anyone wants to think about campaigning, which is probably the last thing at the moment, but get a copy of Get Elected.
Good on you. Thank you, Ruth.
Thanks,
Stuart, thank you very much for your insights. Terrific to have you, and all the best for you and your colleagues at the City of Monash.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate you having me. It's been a good discussion. I look forward to doing a few more of these in the future.
Excellent. We'd love to have you back. I think we'll be talking about council elections before too long, potentially. Steve Cooper, good to have your governance advice, and I think there's perhaps a little bit of homework out of today for us as well.
Looking forward to it, Chris. Thank you.
Good on you, Steve. And Kathryn Arndt, CEO of the VLGA. Thank you, Kathryn. I think for a panel session, it's been, and our first one with a live audience, it's been pretty useful.
Look, it has. Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for your participation. This will be probably the first of many more conversations and interactive sessions we'll have on this topic. Just in terms of how the VLGA is supporting the sector during this time, please keep a lookout for the VLGA Connect series, which Chris is facilitating and moderating for us. We've had some really high-level speakers on that, talking about issues that are critical for the sector at the moment. And I'd like to thank Ruth and Steve and Stuart for their participation today as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathryn, and thanks to everyone for being part of it. We had over 80 participants at one point, which was beyond our expectations. So that is absolutely terrific and just shows there's an appetite for these sorts of discussions. For people who'd like to be part of VLGA Connect, send us your stories. I'm really enjoying talking to people across the state, around the sector, finding out how you're responding to COVID-19, and we're uncovering some really terrific stories that I think are great for people to hear. VLGA's YouTube channel has the 28 episodes that we've produced to date, so if you haven't already, please check them out. And thank you very much to everyone for being part of our panel session today. It's been a pleasure having you, and we'll see you again soon.